Creating the AI voice was a multi-step process. First, we ran every line of dialogue through an automatic text-to-speech program. In the studio, we cued the actress who plays Gladys, Ellen McLean, with the computer-generated sound file. She'd mimic it, and then over the course of several takes, adjust her performance to clean up any words that were unintelligible in the computer version. For instance, here's a line as Ellen delivered it.
Perfect. Please move quickly to the chamber lock, as the effects of prolonged exposure to the button are not part of this test.
Once the recording was done, we processed all the dialogue to give it an extra computery edge. Here's that same line as it appears in the game, with the pitch constrained, pitch modulation suppressed, and the formant moved up.
Perfect. Please move quickly to the chamber lock, as the effects of prolonged exposure to the button are not part of this test.
We designed the post-escape levels to give players brief glimpses of the inner workings of the Enrichment Center. This particular area exposes part of the storage cube distribution system. These little vignettes help make this section of the game visually distinct from the testing chambers, while reinforcing the idea that players are now behind the scenes.
One bizarre fact of game design is that without some serious prompting, players will rarely look up. In this case, the prompt is the ladder. Most players will investigate where the ladder goes, which is up. The ladder actually falls apart as soon as it's touched, but by then it served its purpose.
Through playtesting, we discovered that fatigue set in if we didn't break up the more complicated, deliberately paced puzzles with problems that required the player to perform a much simpler task under time pressure. These pistons proved to be a good foundation for that simpler type of puzzle. Because they feature a moving surface, they also gave us an opportunity to employ some unusual portal transitions, such as ceiling to ceiling.
During development, we'd often run across some piece of level design that would break the portal system. For instance, this ceiling-to-ceiling transition was an unexpected edge case that ended up requiring a lot of effort to make work. We tried never to take the easy route of simply changing the level design to work with existing portal technology. We knew that once the game was out in the wild, custom map creators would stress the system in ways we hadn't even considered, so we made it as flexible as possible.
An important design goal of these post-escape levels was to give players the sense that they're running wild inside the guts of the facility. With that in mind, we added plenty of nooks and crannies for players to crawl into or place portals through. This ended up being a tricky lighting challenge, as the areas needed to be bright enough to navigate, while still being dim enough to feel like obscure, disused sections of the building.
These rocket sentries originally fired lasers. We switched from lasers to rockets after we introduced the glass-breaking mechanic, mainly because glass shattering in a massive rocket explosion turned out to be a lot more satisfying than glass just slowly being melted by a laser. Originally, they also spoke, just like the bullet turrets. Because players often redirect the rockets with their backs to the turret, however, a distinct, uncluttered sound cue was required. The voice simply added too much noise to the rocket redirect mechanic.
Breaking this tube gives players a chance to test out their newly trained rocket redirecting and glass breaking skills in a slightly different context, which helps cement the training.
As the end of the game draws closer, we increase the ratio of time-pressured puzzles, like this turret ambush, to give the players the sense that they're approaching a climactic encounter.
Originally, these catwalks were decorative, but playtesters consistently thought they were significant and often spent a lot of time trying to reach them. We didn't want to stand between people and their desire to walk on the catwalks. So we redesigned the area to make catwalks not only accessible, but also necessary to proceed.
This massive turret ambush was originally a lot more massive, with turrets that dropped from the ceiling and popped out of surprise hatches. In fact, for a while, it was the game's climactic battle. Through playtesting, we learned that this type of pure combat experience didn't really fit with the preceding few hours of player training. Over several iterations, we toned down the combat and made the room more about using portal momentum to fling yourself great distances, a skill that playtesters really enjoyed using, and that's a key component of what eventually became our final battle.
GLaDOS, the rogue disk operating system that now runs Aperture Science, went through a bunch of design iterations. Earlier versions included a floating brain, a sprawling spidery mechanism, and an upside-down version of Botticelli's Rise of Venus built out of robot parts and wire. Eventually, we settled on a huge mechanical device with a delicate robotic figure dangling out of it, which successfully conveys both GLaDOS's raw power and her femininity.
The fiction behind this red phone is that while GLaDOS was being developed, it was somebody's job to sit by it. And if it ever looked like the AI was becoming sentient and godlike, that person would pick up the phone and call somebody to come help. In the point in time where the actual game takes place, it's become obvious that the Aperture Science Red phone plan didn't 100% work out.
One of the things we learned from Narbacular Drop, our student project that became Portal, was that players often thought portals took them into other spaces, or even other dimensions. To help fight that notion, we start players in a visually unique room with memorable objects, so that when they walk through a portal for the first time, they have a clear point of reference, which communicates the idea that they're still in the same basic location. For instance, the radio, which is playing an instrumental version of Still Alive, helps as well by providing some audio continuity.
Portal is effectively an extended player training exercise. We spend a huge portion of the game introducing a series of gameplay tools, then layering those tools into increasingly difficult puzzles. This layering starts here, where we train the button and box mechanic, before introducing the more complicated concept of portals.
Welcome to
Game Name Here.
Hopefully you've already had a chance to enjoy the offbeat perspective and new game mechanic of Portal. To listen to a commentary node, put your crosshair over the floating commentary symbol and press your use key. To stop a commentary node, put your crosshair over the rotating node and press the use key again. Some commentary nodes may take control of the game in order to show something to you. In these cases, simply press your use key again to stop the commentary. Please let me know what you think after you've had a chance to play, as we think we are just at the beginning of taking advantage of this type of gameplay. I can be reached at gaben@valvesoftware.com. Thanks, and have fun.
We put the player character in an orange jumpsuit to reinforce the fact that she's a test subject. Visually, the warmer colors helped her pop out against the colder tones of her environment. Some playtesters were wondering why she could fall so far without getting hurt, the way she would have if she were in Half-Life 2. In response, we added a mechanized heel spring to her lower legs. Afterwards, there was no longer any question about why she could survive such long falls.
These frosted glass observation rooms make the player feel as if they're being watched at all times, while keeping the identity of these watchers a mystery. The rooms serve a practical purpose as well, since we often use them as convenient and logical light sources for the test chambers.
The combination of portal-destroying fields, which we call fizzlers, and the elevators, serve a dual purpose. They provide a clearly identifiable endpoint for each test chamber, while also addressing the more practical problem of how to keep players from portaling across level loads. We eventually integrated the fizzlers into several of our puzzle designs.
It's absolutely critical that players quickly wrap their heads around what a portal is. We noticed early playtesters grasped the concept much more quickly when they caught a glimpse of themselves through a portal. So we deliberately positioned this first portal to ensure that players will invariably see themselves.
We wanted players to feel safe while standing in a portal, so we never kill them or destroy objects within a portal that's closing. Instead, we either push or teleport objects out of a portal as it closes.
We very deliberately introduce and train each gameplay concept in Portal, so that once players reach this spot, we're confident that they know what a portal is and roughly how it works. Early versions of the game let players stumble through the beginning, without always understanding what was going on, which really compromised teaching new concepts. The puzzle you just finished was designed so that stumbling around will almost always lead to a dead end. Completing the puzzle requires walking through a minimum of 5 portals in a specific order. This kind of gating, in which a solid understanding of key gameplay concept is required for success, helped standardize the learning curve of the game tremendously.
In early versions of this map, playtesters would charge down the stairs without noticing what was creating the portals. We introduced a mandatory pause in the action, what we call a gate, to help ensure that players stop and notice the portal gun making the blue portal. A particle effect and a loud noise helped draw their attention.
This room was designed to make players understand that entrance and exit portals aren't tied to the color of the portal. Playtesters often assumed that orange portals were exit only, so we created this puzzle to force players to enter an orange portal.
When rendering the player's view through a portal, we must render a separate image using a virtual camera which looks out of the opposite portal. To obtain a correct image and efficient rendering performance, we render only what is visible to the limited field of view of the opposite portal and exclude objects which lie between the virtual camera and the plane of the opposite portal.
Early versions of Portal featured more detailed, cluttered environments, much like Half-Life 2. We quickly realized that unnecessary objects scattered all over the place distracted players to the point where it actually interfered with the Portal training process. So we simplified the art style to favor clean, focused test chambers. The modular approach we settled on makes it look plausible that the chambers can reform dynamically on these pistons.
For training purposes, there's generally just one correct solution to these early puzzles. The original version of this room didn't have the glass barrier. Playtesters would often stand on the button to open the door and then shoot a blue portal through the opening, bypassing the box entirely. Since this puzzle was meant to illustrate the relationship between boxes and buttons, that solution, while clever, was a failure. So we added the glass barrier to prevent it. Later in the game, however, the puzzles become more open-ended.
Integrating portals with Source Engine's physics system was a complex process that required several iterations to achieve the right balance of performance and correctness. Because portals can be placed virtually anywhere in the game's environment, the physics system had to be modified to allow dynamic changes to its representation of colliding geometry, such as the walls and floor around this box, and any objects which may lie on the opposite side of the portal. Initial implementations of this dynamic collision generation system could take up to 1/2 of 1 second, or 500 milliseconds, to compute the correct collision. This may not sound like a long time in everyday life, but this pause during the portal creation was quite noticeable in the context of a game. Ultimately, we designed a system that creates temporary hybrid physics environments in bubbles around the portals, using less accurate collision than that produced by Source's standard collision generation, but was accurate enough in practice and reduced the time to create dynamic collision representation from 500 milliseconds to just 10 milliseconds, which is an imperceptible pause during portal creation. For the first few months of development, we rendered the views through portals to 2 off-screen textures. This approach was easy to implement and was compatible with a wide range of graphics hardware. Unfortunately, this method was incompatible with anti-aliasing and consumed a large amount of video memory in order to handle recursive views through several portals. Because of these disadvantages, we switched to a system which renders portal views recursively into the frame buffer with the aid of the stencil buffer to isolate pixels corresponding to a given portal. This is a more effective scheme because it is compatible with anti-aliasing and does not consume any additional video memory for off-screen textures.
To make puzzles deeper than just teleporting to the exit, we had to include surfaces that won't hold a portal, which are formally introduced here. We experimented with several surface designs before we settled on this one, whose visual noise and reflectivity make it easy to identify at a distance.
Even though layering player training was a design goal from the start, we still ended up introducing some concepts too quickly. For instance, this used to be the first energy ball redirection puzzle. Playtesting revealed that this puzzle introduced too many new concepts at once, which ended up frustrating a lot of playtesters. In response, we inserted 2 test chambers before this one to make the energy ball redirection training more gradual.
Because our test chamber environments were simplified for training purposes, we created visual hotspots within the rooms to guide players' attention. The design is essentially a balance between round objects and sharp objects. The sharp objects representing background elements, and the round objects, such as doors and movable props, comprising our points of visual interest.
Originally, these scaffolds ran on electrified tracks, but crafty playtesters would hop along the rails to the exit, bypassing the puzzle entirely. We tried to solve this by killing players as soon as they touched the rails. That solution ended up being too much of an overcorrection, as even skilled playtesters were getting frustrated by these one-hit kills in the more complex puzzles later in the game. Making the scaffolds run along immaterial beams of light solved both problems.
We previously talked about how we handle static portal collision, but collision with moving objects on the other side of a portal is a completely different and equally hard problem. Walking onto this scaffold was a very iffy proposition for the first few months of development. We solved the problem of colliding with these dynamic objects by cloning the objects from one portal to the other and strictly controlling what objects are allowed to collide with each other and how they're allowed to collide.
Portal momentum ended up being the hardest concept to convey. For this series of puzzles, which went through more design iterations than virtually any other part of the game, we introduced the idea of redirecting your momentum using portals, slowly, step by step. We even have the AI voice pretty explicitly explain the elements of the puzzle, something we avoided throughout most of the rest of the game.
Originally, these exit portal surfaces were static geometry in the final position, but playtesters stubbornly refused to look up to find them. This is another example of the classic game design problem of coaxing players to look up. By putting the portals on moving pistons, we were able to start them in a position that players were more likely to see,